A quorum has been established.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. Members of the task force and members of the public, welcome to the First in the Nation California Reparations Task Force September hearing, whereby we will discuss in depth topics related to the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migrations. Briefly, at our July hearing, my opening remarks included a recognition of national and international developments that have direct implications to the historic work this task force is engaging in. For instance, in July, I made an acknowledgement of Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday. I also referenced the UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, and the landmark report from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office urging countries worldwide to do more to help end discrimination, violence, and systemic racism against people of African descent and make amends to them through reparations. In the same spirit, I'd like to also acknowledge that since we last met in July, the world's largest digitized and searchable collection of Freedmen's Bureau records are now open to the public. This will allow descendants of formerly enslaved people in the United States to trace their family histories more easily. The documents are surmised to be the first time newly freed Black people appeared in records post-emancipation in 1863. Before the Freedmen's Record collecting, enslaved people were not included in the census and in federal documents. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau towards the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Its goal was to assist formerly enslaved Black people with several tasks, including negotiating labor contracts, legalizing marriages, and locating lost relatives. The Bureau also provided food, housing, education, and medical care to more than 4 million people before it was dismantled. A recent Harris poll surveyed by Ancestry shows that despite the enormous contributions of the organization, 72% of Americans have never heard of the Freedmen's Bureau. Still, it was a pivotal turning point in America and continues to impact the lives of US citizens today. So for the members of the public who are watching this, if this applies to you, please feel free to go to Ancestry.com and see if any of this information relates to you and your family. In closing, I'd also like to acknowledge that the United Nations General Assembly, which is the main policy organ of the United Nations, is meeting this week. Notably, in December 2013, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming the years 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. The theme of the International Decade is People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development. Notably, our task force is right in the middle of this decade and will conclude with our recommendations and findings right before 2024. And so what we're doing today and for the next 2 years is monumental and historic. I'm looking forward to the information that we'll gather and discuss today and tomorrow. From a review of the agenda, you can see that it is a packed agenda. So to ensure that we complete it during the time allocated, we will need to make sure that we follow the timeline established. So to help keep us on time, I'm asking everyone, including myself, to be mindful, and I will remind us as well if we start to fall behind. We anticipate a fair number of comments from members of the public, which is scheduled for 1 hour, beginning at 9:07 and will end at 10:07. Again, welcome, and we will now move forward to agenda item number 2, public comment. I recognize Ms. Aisha.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aisha Martin Walton. I am with the Department of Justice. We are now moving to public comment. Public comment will be for 1 hour, as Chair Moore indicated. Each individual is limited to 3 minutes for public comment. At the 3-minute mark, your microphone will be turned off and you will not be able to turn yourself back on. However, there is a public comment period again tomorrow at the same time and there will be 7 more public meetings, and we welcome everyone in the community to make comments in the future. You may also submit written comments at any time via email at reparationstaskforce@oag.ca.gov. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Trini Hurtado, who will explain the technical process for you. Thank you, Trini.
Hello, my name is Trini, and to participate in public comment, please use the raised hand function. You can find that button on the upper right-hand side of the screen. On the sidebar, there's a shape of a hand. Once you click on that, it will prompt a raised hand feature. On our end, we will accept your raised hand, then you will get a notification at the top center of your screen to continue. You will have to click continue, and once you are accepted and brought into the meeting as a presenter, you will be automatically muted. Once it is your turn to comment, you will be unmuted and will have 3 minutes to speak. At the end of your comment, or at the 3-minute mark, you will be muted and drop back down to attendee. We will accept the raised hand feature as they come in. Once the person in front of you is done speaking, I will say your name to prompt you and you will begin speaking. Please note that there's a 20-second delay between the attendee and presenter mode, so keep that in mind as you're being promoted to presenter mode to provide public comment. I'll start.
Very good.
Hold on. It'll just be a few minutes while we get everyone over. And everyone that I've checked, you need to press the continue button. Tiffany Quarles, you have 3 minutes. You may begin.
Good morning, Task Force. My name is Tiffany Quarles, and I'm with the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, a national grassroots organization dedicated to advocating for reparations for Black Americans who descend from U.S. slavery. We sent a formal letter to you requesting that the task force send a letter directly to President Biden, requesting that he sign an executive order to establish a presidential reparations commission. NAASD has already had the opportunity to sit down with the Biden administration to request this executive order, and we would appreciate your assistance with calling on the president to move on this for the purpose of helping the African American community. I ask today that you please grant our request. Thank you, and that concludes my comment.
Tasha Henneman, you have 3 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Moore, Vice Chair Dr. Brown, and the task force members. My name is Dr. Tasha Henneman, and I serve as Chief of Policy and Government Affairs for PRC in San Francisco. And I also direct the Black Leadership Council, which was founded by PRC's CEO, Brett Andrews. And we are a coalition of California leaders from various sectors that seek to improve the conditions for our Black African American communities. On behalf of the Black Leadership Council, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for your leadership on this issue of reparations. We fully 100% support the goals of the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans and recommend ways to educate California on your findings and recommend appropriate remedies. Black African American people have far too long been on the receiving end of criminalization, misdiagnosis, and other punitive measures that woefully miss the mark on providing appropriate cultural or trauma-informed interventions, often causing long-lasting irreparable harm. We see this happen across one's lifespan and even beginning in utero, not having access to quality, culturally appropriate healthcare. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but while some policy improvements have led the way to addressing the many disparities that Blacks and African American individuals face in their daily lives, there's still a long way to go as we seek to apply equity and parity across all communities, ultimately creating a more just society. The Black Leadership Council seeks to be a catalyst to improve conditions for Black African American populations across the San Francisco Bay Area and California. We are a community convener and coalition that has serves over 500,000 clients per year across a myriad of service modalities. So now is the time for sweeping policies that address the historical legacy of slavery and systemic racism. And we believe that establishing racial equality isn't just about creating diversity, it's about taking intentional action to create equal opportunity for everyone to access quality education, healthcare, wealth, and housing, and much more. To this end, the Black Leadership Council is mobilized to support and develop a sweeping collection of policies to advance our Black prosperity agenda that addresses comprehensive reforms to the state's healthcare, economic, housing, and education systems, and drive racialized inequalities amongst Black and other low-income Californians, including government-inflicted death. So we are pleased with your work. We are here to partner with you. Our request is that we can help you spread your message of reform, and we look forward to partnering with the task force and really look forward to your recommendations that will support Black communities, help us thrive, and enact meaningful change for our communities. Thank you so much for your time and again for your leadership.
Thank you. Friday Jones, you're up. You've been unmuted. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Good morning, task force members. My name is Consa Jones Muhammad. I'm a city commissioner for Mayor Garcetti's Los Angeles Reparations Task Force. I am a co-chair for the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants and the Los Angeles chapter. And our local chapter is a member of the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California. As a state body with the 6th largest economy in the world, it is through the resources of the many state departments and the state budget where the task force has the ability to create and repair our society and the standing of the descendant community within it. There is an opportunity to create a wide variety of benefits in addition to compensation for generations to come. The creation of whiteness and the dehumanization of Blackness has cost this nation its humanity and greater GDP by stifling ingenuity and economic growth. The truth in reconciliation taking place tomorrow is an important part of the repair process. This task force must consider the wealth inequity created by racism and the loss of revenues to the state. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 required whiteness in naturalization law. If you are not white, you are not a US citizen, and if you were not a citizen, you had no political voice. Today, I'm here to exercise my voice. The Coalition for a Just and Equitable California has been steadfast in vocalizing our desire for a strong community engagement plan. I'm thankful to Tammy Mack and Stevie Wonder for allowing me on KJLH Radio and Dominique Suprema and Tavis Smiley of KBLA Radio to publicize this month's hearing dates and the subject matter on today's agenda. NAASD Los Angeles has drafted proposals to the city council members for discretionary funds to be allocated for marketing campaigns for future hearings. We are grassroots advocates willing to think outside the box to increase in community engagement, but this body has to expeditiously initiate a plan so as to not politically disenfranchise the beneficiary community through this process. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I appreciate what you all are doing. Have a great day.
Thank you. Sharice Cryer, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Sharice Cryer. I'm a direct descendant of American slavery on both paternal and maternal side and a second generation Angelino. In August, Leonard Lutton, a Jamaican national of Brooklyn, New York, was sentenced by the U.S. attorney for a lottery scam. In Dr. Javon Scott Lewis's book, Scammer's Yard, it is alluded that such scams are a form of reparations. I have 2 questions for the commission today. One, can the commission clarify if it sees this activity as a form of reparations? And 2, can you please confirm whether the commission is advocating for other descendants of slavery living in the U.S., i.e. non-descendants of American slavery, to be awarded reparations in California? For example, I cannot make a claim to CARICOM for reparations. Those are my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Simon View, you have 3 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Simon Vu. Thank you to the chair and task force members for the opportunity to provide comments. Simon Vu on behalf of CBHA, the California Council of Community Behavioral Health Agencies. CBHA is a statewide association of mental health and substance use disorder nonprofit community agencies that provide behavioral health services to nearly 800,000 Californians. At CBHA, we recognize the impact of health disparities on the communities our member agencies serve, and in particular, communities of color continue to suffer from behavioral health conditions at disproportional rates when compared to their white counterparts. A study shows that Black Americans are 20% more likely to experience serious psychological distress than the general population. In addition, Black adults are more likely to report feelings of sadness and hopelessness than white adults, while less than 9% of Black adults receive mental health services compared to 18% of white adults. For communities of color in America, particularly the Black community, the psychological impact of discrimination, racism, and historical trauma is severe, which exacerbates stigma, which in turn impacts their will and treatment. CBHA is exploring ways to address these inequalities through our Race and Social Equity Task Force. We continue to advocate with our partners in behavioral health to address the racial pandemic in our state and country. And we are very pleased with your work and stand ready to support the task force and provide any assistance and information to further the mission and goals of the task force. Last month, we sent out an introduction letter to the task force, and we're happy to follow up. And thank you so much for your time and leadership.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else wish to make public comment? Please use the raised hand feature.
Ms. Martin Walton, I would like to interject to briefly recognize Member Grills and Member Jones Sawyer.
Please do.
Welcome. Yes, that is all. We can resume with public comment. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to make a public comment today? Trini, do we have anyone else in the queue?
No.
Okay, it is now 9:21, and Chair Moore, we can, it's your pleasure. We can wait a couple more minutes, or we can turn it back over to you to continue the meeting. You please unmute yourself.
I'm wondering, is it possible to reserve, we can do this potentially through a motion, reserve the balance of the time for public comment towards the afternoon to give people another chance to comment? Don't know if that is an option. Or we could wait a few minutes. I don't want to cut off.
Yes,
people's
Madam
time.
Chair.
Yes,
Madam
you are
Chair, this
recognized.
is, yeah,
Ms.
this is
Johnson, you are
Dorita.
recognized.
Thank you. You cannot change the time of the public comment because it's been noticed for this time period. So you need to keep it at this time. You can wait until that time elapses. And that would be the best thing that you do because you've got it for a block of time on the agenda. So you need to adhere to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Parliament Johnson. Yes, go ahead, Member Holder.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have a point of clarification about this public time slot and a suggestion. I'm wondering whether we can, as a task force, resume the agenda and get started during this time slot, but also allow public comment to continue until 10 o'clock. So if we are in the middle of a conversation, we can end the conversation or table it until the speaker, the public commentary goes forward, and then resume.
There is actually another person that would like to speak. I'll go ahead and promote him right now.
Okay.
Your name, please?
Hold on just a second.
Okay, Trini. Very good.
Darius Young, you have 3 minutes.
Yes, my name is Darius Young, and I represent the Bay Area Health Inequity Initiative, also known as BARHI, and we are the membership body of the 11 Bay Area Health Departments. And we came together in May, and we convened a group of 35 African-American-led organizations to come up with a Black housing strategy within the Bay Area region, effectively known as Black Hat. And so while I recognize that reparations covers a wide range of remedies that we need to seek and that we need to address at this time, we also would like to highly put on the radar that, we know that housing is one of the worst forms of discrimination that we have had in this country. And we also know that when it comes to the health disparities, those things that drive the inequities within our health, things that happen outside of the doctor's office, they are related to housing. And it was ever so present when we looked at when the veil was lifted off of the inequities and all the things that we did during this COVID-19 pandemic. With that said, we hope that BARHI, as well as the Black Housing Advisory Task Force, will be able to work together with you on remedies to our housing situation and all the other things that have helped to has impacted our African-American-led population and has led to inequities, over incarceration, over policing, all those things in our communities that have brought us to a point to where the equity is not the same for everybody else. And as we address these issues today and look forward to reparations being enacted, we also would like to hold right now that there is that there are ways right now that we could address some of the things starting now in housing, and that's to look at policies and the monies that have already come down through the ARPA funding, the historic state surplus, and the other dollars that should be coming down soon from the infrastructure plan. So we look forward to working with you along with the task force, and we hope that you will give us your time. And we know that you will do a good job. And I really would like to thank Camilla because she did address our group I think it was back in May. So thank you, and we appreciate you, and we look forward to making this what we are owed come to reality. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers? There are no other speakers at this time.
Okay, so we can move on with the agenda recognizing member holder suggestion. So in the event that members of the public would like to address the task force members between now and 10:07, you can call between that time frame, and we will stop our agenda to recognize the public comment. So now we will move to agenda action item number three, which is the approval of the minutes. So the minutes from the July 9 task force meeting were sent to task force members with the materials, and we've all had a chance to review them. So at this time, I would like to ask task force members if there are any questions, comments, or corrections regarding the minutes? Member Jones Sawyer, you are recognized.
Madam Chair, I would like to move the approval of the minutes.
Is there a second? Oh,
You can still ask questions. Just wanted to move the agenda along.
okay. Are there any questions related to the minutes? Okay, so there's a motion on the floor by Member Jones Sawyer to accept the minutes as presented. Is there a second to the motion?
I second. This is Cheryl Grills.
So Member Grills seconds the motion. So it has been moved and seconded to adopt the minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? Okay. Hearing no discussion, we will vote, and we will vote by roll call. I will call on Parliamentarian Johnson, who will recognize Ms. Belton, who will then conduct the roll call. Parliamentarian
Yes.
Johnson, you are recognized.
Thank you. Ms. Belton, please call the roll and record the vote.
Thank you. Chair Moore, your vote, please.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Dr. Brown.
Aye.
Vice Chair. Senator Stephen Bradford.
Aye.
Senator Stephen Bradford votes aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills.
Aye.
Dr. Cheryl Grills votes aye. Lisa Holder.
Aye.
Lisa Holder votes aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer.
Aye.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer votes aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis.
Aye.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis votes aye. Don Tamaki.
Aye.
Don Tamaki votes aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
Aye.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Madam Chair, on the motion, there were 9 yay votes, no nay votes, and no abstentions.
Thank you, Ms.
Excuse-
Belton. Oh, excuse me.
We have another speaker, another commenter.
Okay, one moment. Ms. Belton, thank you. The vote was 9 yeas and 0 nays. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The minutes are approved as presented. I will now move to Trini Hurtado and Ms. Aisha Martin Walton to recognize a member of the public. Thank you.
Carl T, you need to click on the continue button so I can move you over, please. Carl T, you have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Member of Allen Temple and the public ministry. And we are very interested in educating our community about reparations. And to that end, we have already had a virtual town hall, which in addition to reflecting on the last election, we also discussed in detail reparations with Dr. Shirley Weber, who was quite informative, and we definitely appreciate. So one of my questions is, as a member of a community organization, how can we best educate the community? We would like to have several more town halls and are wondering if any of the commission will be willing or interested in participating, and how can we make that happen? After such a long time, I think this is such an important step in our history that we really, really want to educate as many people as we can. So that is just my request and my appreciation and thanks for you all being on this commission. I know it's long and arduous task, but I just want you to know that there are people out here that want to definitely resoundingly spread this information and educate our community so that we can be, on task with whatever the commission suggests and move this very important issue forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Are there any other speakers in the queue for now?
No, at this time, no.
Okay, so at this moment, we will move to agenda item number 4, further consideration of community engagement. Again, to the members of the public, if you would like to call in for public comment between now and 10:07, you can do that. We will continue to go on with our agenda, and we will pause to recognize members of the public in the event that they have any public comment to share with us. So now we will discuss agenda item number 4, further consideration of community engagement. So at our last hearing, we had an open discussion about our community engagement plan. Since we last met, task force members were sent a draft scope of work from the UCLA Bunch Center, and it included, among other materials, that member Cheryl Grills will share with us. So at this time, I would like to recognize member Grills, who will give us an update and introduce Professor Michael Stoll. Member Grills, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start with providing everyone with an overview of where we have grown and moved since our last meeting. I'm going to share my screen. However, share screen, this one. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sharing with you now an update on where we are at with the California Reparations Task Force in terms of the community engagement strategy. First, I wanted to note that we are operating within, and we're mindful of the fact that we're operating within a very broad socio-ecological landscape. At the heart of our focus, of course, is African American descendants of enslaved Africans. But this is a reality that exists within a broader scope, which is we coexist with people of African ancestry in the state as well as in the country. There are reparations activities happening across the state in different counties and cities, and there is a national landscape of activity happening around reparations. In addition to that, there's the international landscape. Why do I share all of this? Because there are intersecting sources of information that may emerge in the community engagement process. In terms of the listening sessions, we are targeting about 12 listening sessions that will be spearheaded by a series of anchor organizations that will lead the community engagement process because of their understanding of and their networks in the state, understanding the needs and the issues and concerns of Black constituents. We want to make sure that this communications, messaging and marketing strategy is an integral part of the community engagement process, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And we'll have our anchor organizations joined by what I'm calling tier 2 local organizations, who are actually essentially on the ground, boots on the ground, connected to various constituency groups, able to mobilize members of their constituents and bring them to the listening sessions. So how the process works is pretty similar to what I described before, which is that we would have these series of anchor organizations who have vast networks and a presence in the state around the Black agenda issues, and that we will then move to connect those anchor organizations with a tier 2 local organization or series of them to make sure that there was a nuanced understanding of the needs of the folks in that regard. And then we have different areas of foci, but essentially how the process will work is that the anchor organizations will provide information to a communications entity to provide education in advance of any listening session, so that there's a shared level of understanding about what the task force's mission is, and then to give basic information from different perspectives about what is reparations, what are the harms that have been done, and then from there get the input of the community that will then be directed back to the task force via summaries and analyses by the Ralph Bunche Center, which would be hosting the anchor organizations and the logistics processes involved in community engagement. So the different areas of foci, these are again examples or samples. They would be finalized through the input of the anchor organizations and the tier 2 local organizations, but could be regional focused listening sessions for folks who are systems involved, definitely listening sessions that are focused on the needs of Black farmers, economics, housing, employment, etc. Again, the community engagement process will walk hand in hand with a communication strategy. The Bunche Center will be entertaining options for firms that would be able to provide a robust communication strategy that would be informed by the anchor organizations and the tier 2 organizations that will use a multi-pronged approach to community communications and almost marketing and branding, if you will, of the task force and its mission, and ensuring that we are tracking community sentiment and feedback. So in terms of a timeline, what we're looking at is about a 1-year process, beginning in October with all of the anchor organizations selected by the Bunche Center. The communications firm would be selected in October by the Bunche Center. The anchor organizations would start meeting in November, and they would select the tier 2 organizations. We would like to pilot a listening session with a group of college students that would be held virtually. That is in the planning stages. And then there would be communications and messaging beginning in January and listening sessions beginning in January of 2022. Sorry, that's a typo. And then from there, we would conduct those 12 listening sessions over the course of the remaining months with a conclusion in September of 2022. And I do know that we have a report that would be coming out somewhere during that process, I believe around June. And findings to date can be shared in advance for that particular meeting. So the final comments that I want to share is that our time frame is about a 1-year process, 12 listening sessions, and the Ralph Bunche Center would be providing a number of services, including selection and launch of the communications firm and strategy, the anchor organizations, and the tier 2 local community-based organizations with input from the anchor organizations, managing the listening session logistics, the who, what, when, where, and then also documenting, analyzing, and extracting themes from the listening sessions, and providing data from listening session surveys that they will provide. So that is a quick overview. I'd like to now actually introduce Dr. Michael Stoll, who is a professor of public policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Dr. Stoll's published work explores questions of poverty, labor markets, migration, and crime. In 2007, the state of California's Legislative Black Caucus sponsored a report on the status of Black Californians, and Professor Stoll was one of the principal investigators of that report. Much of his work has been featured in a variety of media outlets, and he also regularly advises the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Labor, as well as state and local governments in various capacities. Dr. Stoll received his PhD from MIT and a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. Dr. Stoll, would you like to share with the task force your thoughts on the community engagement process?
Madam Chair. I have a procedure question.
Oh, sorry. Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
At what point will the task force be able to be engaged in sharing questions or comments regarding this presentation?
Vice Chair Brown, we will take questions from task force members after Professor Stoll gives his statement.
Very good. All right.
Thank you for the question. Professor Stoll, are you available? Who is that?
Point of
Ms.
order.
Belton? Yes.
Thank
You're
you, Madam
recognized.
Chair. Because the task force is running early, we actually do not have Professor Stoll yet. We had prepared him for this possibility, but not this early.
Right.
And so I would suggest that the task force might want to direct questions to Member Grills where appropriate, and we will certainly unmute Professor Stoll as soon as he's available.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bolton. So again, I just want to do a brief a reminder to members of the public. Public comment period is still open. So if you have any public comment, you can call between now and 10:07, and we will recognize you. In the meantime, we will turn back to agenda item 4, further consideration of community engagement plan, and we will now take questions from the task force. But before I take any question from the task force, I want to recognize Member Grills again. Do you have any other comments? Yes, do you have any other comments?
No, I think the things that Dr. Stoll was going to speak to, the members of the task force already have in the scope of work that he submitted prior to this meeting.
Madam Chair.
Chair Brown, you are recognized.
As it regards the overall presentation by Dr. Grills, maybe it was mentioned and I didn't get it, but in terms of the involvement of stakeholders, I noticed the Black farmers were there, but I did not see Black educators. I did not see Black civil rights advocates, and particularly the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Black church, which has been, back to our enslavement, our bastion, our high tower of hope. We have to, in my estimation, engage those significant entities in any community engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. On my slide, it listed that this was a sample. I did not try to provide an exhaustive list of what the different constituent groups would consist of. And absolutely all of the groups that you mentioned would definitely be invited. The challenge or the task, I'll put it that way, at hand is to figure out how within the context of 12 listening sessions to best organize things so that all of those different voices are heard. So for example, there might be a statewide listening session specifically geared toward the Black church, toward Black civil rights matters, et cetera. There may be regional focus listening sessions that would then be able to bring in, education or whatever the case might be. So that was not an exhaustive list. That was not the final list. That was just to give you some examples of what the different constituent groups would be.
Okay, I have a question, and it's related to the organizations who may or may not be involved in this process. So from my understanding of your comments, Member Grills, you stated that the Bunch Center would be the ones to select the anchor organizations and the tier 2 organizations. And I'm sure we can talk about this more in depth, maybe when Stoll comes, Professor Stoll is present, but I'm curious. Here. Oh, okay. Hi, Professor Stoll. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Let me just try to get my video working.
Okay, while you get your video together, I do see that there is someone who wants to give public comment. We are still in the public comment period. So at this moment, I would like to go to Ms. Hurtado and Ms. Marie Walton. Is there someone, a member of the public, who's ready to speak at this time?
Yes, Marjorie L. Melvin. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Can you hear me? If you can just thumbs up, great. My name is Marjorie Melvin. I was born and raised in Southern California. I'm a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Pomona Valley Alumni Chapter. I'm also a 4th generation African Methodist Episcopal member. I am a member of Prim Tabernacle AME Church here in the city of Pomona. I am a lifetime member of the National Council of Negro Women and a parent and teacher with the California African American Parents of Diamond Bar. My question to the task force is related to the organizations involved in shaping the framework surrounding the reparations program. And so I would like to know why specifically UCLA Bunch Center was chosen as the center organization to assist with shaping policy surrounding reparations. And my request would be to have the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California be considered as either the center organization and or the anchor organization, one of the anchor organizations surrounding the framework for shaping reparations in California. Having been a prison advocate or an advocate against over-incarceration, I think it's very important to have folks who are actually doing the work, actively engaged, and have brought reparations to the forefront to be involved in this this movement. And those are my comments. And again, my name is Marjorie Melvin. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. There are no other commenters at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Hurtado. Now we will go to Professor Stoll. Again, brief reminder, we are in the public comment period. So between now and 10:07, members of the public can continue to make public comment, and we will see the agenda to recognize members of the public. Just also as a reminder, on the agenda, this agenda item number 4, further consideration of community engagement plan, was planned to be for 10:10 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. So we are vastly ahead of schedule. But again, if members of the public would like to speak, you have between now and 10:07 to do so. Now I will go back to and recognize Professor Stoll. Welcome and glad to see you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm glad the meeting is moving faster than on the agenda, and I had to be in transition for a family matter. So that's why you see my background the way that it is. But let me state that first and foremost, thank you for inviting me to be here. And let me state that the Bunch Center's role is simply to be supportive. We do not consider ourselves a policy development body in this project. Our job, as we see it, is to support the efforts of the task force to be objective observers and trained analysts to report back what we find from the convenings, as well as you see what Dr. Grills had proposed or spoke about, that I had proposed, the development of methods and tools to assess the sentiments of the general public around the issues that are brought forward by the task force and that bubble up from the convenings, as well as the ability to synthesize in an objective way what is discussed and found. We do not see ourselves as a body that proposes policy or that influences the ideas of the task force or to shape public opinion. Our job as analysts is simply to use our skills at analysis and summary to, as best as we can, comprehensively, analytically, and categorically report back what is being discussed and found. So, for example, one idea that I had proposed is that in addition to the general public comments that will come through the convenings, that we would, in consultation with the anchor organizations, develop a survey that we could administer to either convening participants, to some broader population defined in conjunction with the anchor organizations or with the task force, to get overall central tendency of opinions and preferences of those who are involved in this deliberative body. And and what we do, because we're trained analysts, is to summarize that in a way that doesn't reflect our opinions or our positions, but the positions that have been expressed through the convenings. And we will do so by also recording them, using qualitative techniques to analyze categories that emerge and how frequently they emerge, as well as to administer a survey that will be deliberately
who should be included in this base. And then you have Black psychologists. So I'm hoping that the thought is that we must be inclusive of those who've been out there in the field, in the trenches, and have much to show in terms of dealing with this evil of enslavement, discrimination, and dehumanization of Black folk.
Dr. Brown, this is Dr. Grills again. Since you named me in your comments and you expressed concerns, let me reiterate that what was in that slide were merely samples of anchor organizations, and not even names were anchor organizations, but samples of foci for the listening sessions. And that was not meant to be considered an exhaustive list. Let me also speak to something that Chair Moore was, I believe, beginning to ask a question about. With these anchor organizations, the point of of the anchor organizations and which organizations would be selected is expressly around the goal of reach and inclusion. An anchor organization would be, the criteria for an anchor organization is that they are part of a large network that could expand and make sure that as much coverage as possible is occurring in who is touched by the outreach for participation in the listening sessions. Secondly, when we look at some of the anchor organizations that may be under consideration right now, they in fact speak to exactly what you're hoping to be represented. For example, one of the organizations that may be under consideration is a coalition led by and including congregations, Black clergy, a coalition of Black clergy and faith-based organizations in one region of California. Another potential anchor organization is focused on social justice organization that has a network of over 24 Black-led organizations focused on a variety of social justice issues. Another potential anchor organization is focused on the whole issue around census and redistricting, and has an extensive network across the state that's multi-issue. So again, the point is really about reach and inclusion, not about exclusion.
Right.
Okay, one more. Oh, Vice Chair Brown. I want to recognize the members of the public because the public comment period is still open. We have less than 10 minutes actually. It closes at 10:07. There's a couple of members of the public who are waiting to speak. Hate to interject during this robust discussion, but let's acknowledge the members of the public at this time. Ms. Hurtado and Ms. Marie Walton.
Yes, Chair Moore and members, there are 3 people in the queue, and these are the last 3 people that we can take public comments from. Thank you. Rini?
Nzinga, you are now unmuted and you have 3 minutes to speak. Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to move to the next speaker. We'll try and get your sound worked out. Angela Nerva, you have been unmuted and you have 3 minutes to speak.
My God.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you for your comment.
Next speaker.
Chris L. You are unmuted. You may now speak.
Hey, thanks for hearing me. Thanks for all of your work. Good to see everybody today. Happy Thursday. And thanks for spending all day today and tomorrow doing this important work. I actually want to talk a little bit about community engagement and I just have to be honest, I came in kind of late, so I don't have the full benefit of Dr. Grills' plan to review yet. But I do want to talk a little bit about community engagement and outreach more broadly, and just give you some examples of my own sort of experience and working, as most of you know, with the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, CJEC, and working to raise awareness and do community engagement around what you are doing right now, right? So again, I don't have the benefit of Dr. Grills' plan, but I do want to suggest and put on your spirits and put on your radars that a lot of times when we do community engagement, when governments and government bodies do community engagement, it's focused around groups, right? It's very focused around groups that we lean on very heavily, right, to perform a lot of the outreach on behalf of the body itself. And that's good, but I want us to also think more broadly about community engagement and actually a more direct approach and actually going to people themselves too, right? I wouldn't just rely on actually group-based community outreach. I would also do and find ways to do and support direct contact to Black folks in California, because quite honestly, not everybody that we need to talk to is going to be touched by these groups. And that's just a fact of the reality of Black life now, right? We are in many ways disconnected from even the groups and organizations that are here to do us well. So let's think more broadly about that. I hope that is included and there's space to have that included in Dr. Grills' framework. I also want to plug here the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California as one of the organizations that I think should be at the top of the list priority-wise for doing a lot of this work. We're already doing a tremendous amount of work. We've already done a tremendous amount of work. We will continue to do it because this is our lives and we're here to the end. But just want to put us on your radar if we're not already, and also the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, which is a really awesome national organization that's doing a lot of great reparations related work. Also, we're regular Black folks, we're regular community members, and we're here to engage and to help and support this process to reach the rest of us. Okay, because every single one of us is going to have to be a part of this. Thank you much. I will yield the balance of my time. Have a great day.
Thank you, Chris. We are close to the end of our 1 hour limit for public comments, so the next person will be our last speaker. Trini?
Okay, we're gonna try this again. I've chatted with him. We'll see if we can hear him this time. Nzinga, you have 3 minutes. You are our last speaker.
Is there anyone else in the queue that's not Nzinga that could potentially take their place?
Yes, there are 3 people in the queue.
You should recognize them.
Would you like to recognize all 3 or just the next one?
3. Yes, all 3. And then we'll close it. Thank you so much.
Marcus Champion, you have 3 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcus Champion. I am a California native, born and raised in Inglewood. Also a member of the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, as well as the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants Los Angeles, AASDLA. And I would like to recommend both those orgs and suggest both those organizations, CJEC as well as NAASDLA, as anchor orgs for the community outreach. And similar to what my brother Chris Lodgen said before me, I think it's imperative that the public is directly engaged. And also, if the task force as well as the Department of Justice can make that a imperative priority to engage the public, because in doing our due diligence and doing our work, we recognize that when it comes to knowledge of this task force, when it comes to knowledge of the work that's happening right now in this important, very important reparations work, our greater Black community within the state is not aware of what's going on. And that makes it very hard to get the work done when the people don't know what's actually happening. So again, I would like to recommend CJEC as well as NAASD Los Angeles as anchor orgs to help advance this work. And I want to thank you all for the work you've done and continue to do.
Thank you for your comment. Cash Gains, you now have 3 minutes.
Mic check. What's good, y'all?
Yes,
I'm Black American on both. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Black American on both sides, just for context. First, I wanted to say thank you guys for the work you're doing. Reparations is very important to us in modern day. Many people in my generation have become disillusioned with the voting process. I mean, I'm not going to belabor the room, but again, direct cash payments is something that I've been very focused on myself in studying reparations, as well as the 40 acres claim. That was going to be my just kind of question for the room, or something to marinate on. As California is one of the richest states in America and comparable economically to some countries, I'm sure it's already been mentioned before, it's a shining beacon for setting a high ceiling for what reparations could look like. So just keeping that in mind, I hope that that's well understood. What are y'all's thoughts on trying to connect our reparative justice to so-called influencers of our time, and specifically to Silicon Valley as well, and in a way even the Black church? And that's by having a 40 acres and a Tesla claim, essentially an update to the mule, where Elon Musk would have to argue why he wouldn't fulfill a claim for 38 million cars for Black Americans. In my understanding, Gavin Newsom trying to move California off of being on gasoline cars anyway. So just something to keep in mind, that we are very, very interested in not just the direct cash payments as reparationists, but in our land, and trying to connect it to something sexy for the next generation. And again, this connects to the Black church, as was mentioned earlier, because it was the Black church who gave that solution to General Sherman of 40 acres. It's just I'm not with a mule no more. I'm with a Tesla, or something that's an update and a way, like I said, to connect to Silicon Valley or to, you know, influencers of our time, because it's time that this gets done. So thank you guys again. Shout out to California for being the first and the foremost. And much love to the room.
I have one more person in the queue. Her name is Shanetta Davis. If you could press the continue button so I can move you over. Otherwise, we'll be moving forward. Okay, it looks like she is not responding. So,
All right, Trini, thank you so much. Well, thank you all, public commenters this morning. We have reached the allotted time for the public comment. If you were not able to provide a public comment, we invite you to attend public meetings or to submit comments or testimony via email at reparationstaskforce@oag.ca.gov. I will now turn the meeting back over to Chair Moore.
Excuse me, Chair Moore, Ms. Davis just, while Aisha was making her comment, she just transferred over. Would you like to hear from her?
I'm unmuted now. Thank
Yes,
you
you are.
all. It is my honor to be able to speak with you all. I'm known for being short and sweet. And my comment is the designation of who we are attaining these resources, benefits for. Are we clear that it should be Black American descendants of chattel slavery and Jim Crow? Are we clear on who these resources and benefits are for? That's my question and my comment.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, that concludes public comment today.
Thank you, Ms. Marie Walton, and thank you, Ms. Hurtado, for assisting the task force with the public comment period. Now we will resume to agenda item number 4, further consideration of the community engagement plan. And we are right on time and up to date with the agenda. And just as a timekeeping reminder, this discussion will last until 10:45 a.m. Then we will resume with agenda item number 5, which is our first witness panel for the day. So I would like to, Vice Chair Brown, did you have a question that you wanted to pose to Professor Stoll, or should we, should I recognize Professor Stoll in the event that you wanted to continue on with your presentation? Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized in the event you have a question or comment.
My only comment is that I want to reiterate and make it perfectly clear. The concern is that in the concept, in the plan that was presented, for there not to be the vision of the involvement of basic organizations and institutions that have been a part of this struggle since the dove flew out of Noah's Ark, if I may put it that way. I think we have to be very careful that we make sure that we're making optimum efforts to engage those persons who are in the trenches, who have the respect in the communities, and our statement of all in the family. And we want to be inclusive and not exclude anyone. But I don't think we need to at all be compromised in any way by intentionally or unintentionally excluding anybody in this thing that's a family affair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. And just to add to that, it's a comment that I have, and it leads to a question for Professor Stoll and Member Grills, but I see that she had to step out. My question is around the idea of reach, right? Like, have we defined what it means, what reach means? That's something that I'm grappling with presently. When we are, attempting to identify anchor organizations for reach, what does that really mean? That's just something that, like I said, I'm grappling with. So, and my concern is that, and I think someone already illustrated this in a public comment, there's so many Black Americans, who aren't necessarily tied to organizations or to legacy organizations. And so we have to, in my opinion, get creative as to who we're engaging in this process. And I agree that inclusiveness and inclusion should be a #1 priority in terms of selection criteria. But it's the reach part that I'm not really understanding, because I can see how utilizing reach as a criteria can be exclusionary, if that makes sense.
Oh, can I share something about that? As I had mentioned in my presentation, it's very critical that the community engagement process be occurring lock and step with the communication strategy, right? So it's through the communication strategy, using radio, billboards. I've been getting a lot of education about how communications work, but that would be a way to reach people who are not connected to some of these legacy organizations, as you mentioned. And so it's not, and that communications entity would be part of the meetings of the anchor organizations, so that we can figure out where are the holes, where is the, what groups might be left out, because they're not part of any kind of organized social justice or action campaign process. So communications is necessary, along with whatever networks the anchor organizations can tap into.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that too, from the Bunge Center's perspective as an academic unit whose specialty and expertise is in gathering data and analyzing data. But I do want to share Dr. Brown's concern, and it's my own actual value too, which I'm not putting at center of the work, but I just want to express, which is that this body has to be inclusive, and you have to include as many voices and bodies as possible. And so the question is how best to do that. And from an academic perspective, Dr. Grills is right, is that you need anchor organizations coupled with media and communication strategies that are able to link people who are potentially at the margins of participating to nudge them into participation, right? At Bunch, for similar kinds of activities, not at this scale, when you try to solicit information from individuals by either contacting them by phone or mail or email to participate, response rates are terribly low. They're usually around 3 to 6%, right? But when you couple that with legitimate organizations that have trust and standing in a community, coupled with communications, media strategies that let people know through public announcements that this is important and that here are your opportunities, those kind of interactions tend to bump up participation in significant ways. Because you just don't want the people whose voices we hear all the time who are at the front lines. You also want to hear people who have opinions but are not able to express them, and sometimes we get interesting ideas in that way, just like the public forum with the 40 acres and a Tesla, right? You get interesting ideas in that way. So Bunch's position is always in this process to be supportive, but also to be exclusive and to be exhaustive and to be objective and to be able to express the broadest views and inclusive views as possible through this process. And that's the role that we see ourselves as partners, as academic partners, as research partners, as programmatic partners with expertise to be able to collect this data and analyze it in a way that can be useful to the task force without any a priori assumptions or without any political opinion being expressed by Bunch. We've done this for since its inception in the 1960s. And this is our comparative advantage and we hope an asset to the task force process and deliberations.
Thank you.
Person Moore.
Yes, Member Scott Lewis, you are recognized, and then I will recognize Member John Sawyer. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. So to Professor Stoll and Professor Grills, I have a question around the issues of scope and scale, much in line with some of the comments that have been made. even from the public comments, we can see there's a great deal of concern around geographic representation. And so my question is, well, how does this plan accommodate or attend to the scope of the African American community within the state of California? In other words, there is a, UCLA being located in Southern California. What is the plan for actually attending to the needs of Black American Northern Californians, and of course the communities who might, be represented in Central California? And so in attending to that scope, what is exactly the kind of infrastructure of the Button Center and its ability to accommodate, that growing scope of representation that's required? Orgs, A through F needing to be replicated across these various geographies. LA has a very robust organizing community. So does the Bay Area. And so I would just love to have a clearer sense as to how the geographies are planned to be represented across this program, which I do in fact like quite a lot. Thank you.
Sure, I could start. Thank you for that comment. In fact, it's because of the very point you're making that this idea of an anchor organization emerged around what kind of entities would be best suited to make sure that we are covering California writ large and not focusing in on the usual suspects, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, et cetera. So one of the reasons that we looked at this idea of an anchor organization was that they actually have connections. They're part of a network. They're leading a network that is statewide, that's covering Northern, Central, Southern California, that's covering Inland Empire, that's covering, the shoreline, if you will. So the balance of these anchor organizations needs to be such that they are able to touch and tap into all of the different, or as many of the different sectors of California as possible. And then also why there's this notion of a tier 2 is that there may be small pockets where there is important information that needs to be gleaned from those Black communities. And so those tier 2 organizations would be the ones who are the boots on the ground, trusted, who have a constituency, but also know how to reach the broader community. They know what outlets, for example, are best suited to reach elder African Americans or younger age populations, or folks who are part of one of the systems, whether that's the carceral system or the education system or the child welfare system, et cetera. So to your point, it's that very reason that we are looking at these anchor and tier 2 organizations concept.
Yes, and let me also add a personal background note so that you get to know me more, since many of you may not know me and I'm getting to know you, and I'm glad to be here. But you should also note that I was involved and helped with the State of Black California report almost 20 years ago with then State Assembly member Karen Bass. And one of the pieces of the project in developing the State of Black California, which was a report on the overall socioeconomic health conditions of Black Californians, was to have a public convening component. And that public convening component was a process by which we were able to get public input from across the state, but mostly Black Californians, around both their ability to identify the problems that they wanted to see solved and to also express solutions. And so one of the problems that we had was exactly what Jovan Scott Lewis just talked about, which is this problem of representation. But there we were able to look at data and look at where the Black densities were across the state. And you can see they've changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. We have a lot in Inland Empire, there's a lot in Central Valley, in Modesto, Fresno, right? There's all these other places that people wouldn't think would be, central areas of Black concentration, but they are. And so we were able to use that data also to see where it is that we had to be outside of the quote usual suspects that people just identified. So that would be part of the thrust too, to make sure that we understand where Black Californians are living, and also be able to use both the anchor organizations in the way that Dr. Grills talked about, but importantly, the tier 2 organizations who are going to be more nimble and are going to be more connect. I wouldn't say more connected, but they're going to also know where a lot of shifts and where Black residents are that would want to be able to be contacted and participate in this process. It has to be a statewide process. This is a statewide task force. This is about discussions around problem identification and policy discussion around reparations for Black Californians. There has to be the engagement, the design of the convenings, and the design of the potential survey to be able to collect information from Black Californians across the state.
Could I add an observation? One moment, please.
Member Scott
before I see, but I think, you know, what might be helpful, and I would like to suggest, Dr. Grills, is that maybe we have some examples or sample, example organizations. My observation has been that a lot of these kinds of, centers, programs, what have you, are actually quite regionally focused. And so I would want to actually see some examples of some organizations that have that statewide scope. This is based upon my observation. And if we can't, you have these 6 areas. If we accommodate what Dr. Amos Brown asked for, right, alongside some of the other areas like in health, education, housing, family, the public commenter, made a statement about unaffiliated. That Chairperson Moore also reiterated. The scope is actually quite broad, and I think I would feel more comfortable if I were able to see a few examples of organizations that had that statewide scope. And if we weren't, especially in some of these key areas, and if we weren't, I would just maybe suggest considering, establishing, another who could take up some of that regional focus, whether it's a Northern Californian partner, or meaning someone alongside the Bund Center, right? Some organization alongside the Bund Center to kind of oversee the kind of breadth of the geography that this really important strategy would need to cover. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And I would also mention that so I think the task force members submitted suggestions. There was an Excel sheet that I received of organizations to consider, and so that's definitely been shared with the Bunch Center, and we will. No one has been invited yet because we don't have an approved process. So we didn't want to make invitations, like get ahead of the process. So all the recommendations can be sent to Bunch Center. And again, if there are organizations that you think are important to put in the into the process of consideration, please do send that to me or send that to Professor Stoll, so that we do have a robust list from which the Bunch Center can do its due diligence in the final selection.
Dr. Grills, could I also just state too, because I think very.
I have a point of order, Madam Chair.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Friends, we should be, and I hope so, that we are family. And family ought to be of a climate where people can share their true, transparent feelings. We can get off the dime on this matter by looking at, number one, there was not an announcement made by this task force requesting proposals from wherever to do this community engagement. And this is no indictment of the Bunch Center at all. So I hope we will look at this matter as we would look at our shirt, our blouse having wrinkles in it. You hang with each other and you iron out the wrinkles and move on and put on the garment. This matter needs to be ironed out. And if there are other groups could have presented a proposal that did not have the opportunity, say it and do it. Or else we are not paragons of that principle of equality of opportunity and justice.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown, for that point of order. I'm sure Member Grills and Professor Stoll could address that in time, but I did want to recognize Member Jones Sawyer. Please excuse me, Member Jones Sawyer, you are now recognized. You are on mute.
Oh. How do I unmute?
You're good now.
I'm good now?
Yes.
Okay. I want to make sure I thank Dr. Grills for her work. It appears that she will not just lead this process as a member of this committee, knowing how we feel of the outreach and making sure that everyone, all parts of California, are involved in the outreach. She will make sure that the UCLA Bunch Center is able to do their work. In some ways, it pains me as a proud USC alumni who represents USC in this district. I have to tell you, the Bunch Center is the best. It has been the best for decades when it comes to African Americans and getting data for the California Legislative Black Caucus. Not only do you need a group that can do this research, that has not only the skills, abilities, the capacity to get it done, but the part that Dr. Stoll said about impartiality to make sure we get the facts, not preconceived facts, but the facts from an academic point of view. Because that's extremely important as we make recommendations to the legislature and to the governor, so that whatever we decide we're going to do, whether it's a house and a Tesla, it doesn't matter. Or who gets what, who shot John. We're talking about how to spend the money when we ain't got the money. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to present almost an academic thesis on why we need reparations. Yes, we're okay with us. Talking to other Black people, we got it. But you don't know the struggle that Dr. Weber had to go through just to create this task force, just to have this conversation by members of California who do not believe in what we do and what we want to do and what California needs to do and what this country needs to do. And there are Black folks that actually believe that slave owners ought to get reparations too. So we're not all together on this either. And so I would suggest, since we have a member of our body on this, working with the Bunch Center, and again, it pains me to say, they are the best. And they've been the best for decades, as they said, since Karen Bass and others. The California Legislative Black Caucus wouldn't have fought for the Bunch Center to get funding every year. We've increased the funding because we knew we needed that group to speak for us to give the facts about what we need in California. If they weren't there, I don't know who we would have to go to. So I'm speaking not only on behalf of the center and what they do, but I'm also speaking that we need to have a group that when we bring this information back to the legislature, to the governor, to Republicans, to moderates, who may not share what we're going to propose, because we may be proposing a lot of money. When they see UCLA Bunch Center, it's going to have some gravitas in the legislature. People are going to look up and have to respect what they say. So I understand the reticence about making sure we get to everyone. I'm a visual person. I would love to see the list of everyone they plan to reach. I don't need to see the list because I have unbelievable confidence that Dr. Grills will make sure that anyone that contacts anyone on this feed right now, and anyone that's listening right now, we will make sure that their ideas are incorporated in the final recommendations. Let me say this again, recommendations that we make to the legislature and to the governor, that we can get it funded. And I don't know if we needed a motion to approve the UCLA Bunch Center, but I will be making that right now.
Madam Chair, I have another point of order. If it is a foregone conclusion that when this task force was established, that the Bunch Center was to be the entity that would do this work, fine. I have no problem with that. Let's be upfront, be candid. But there may be other groups based on their merit who feel that they should have been considered. And if you can lay the facts on the table that this is it, so may it be. But understand that God's grace, God's genius is all around. That's what the system has done, acted in the past as if only certain sectors, only certain races had the brains, had the skills. So that's all Brother Amos is saying. Let us be transparent and upfront. And if that is it, so may it be. But don't give us the impression that we are about reparations, restoration, and justice. And then we become agents to the kinds of practices and principles that were exclusionary. I rest my case.
I
make the motion, Madam Chair, that the Bunch Center would do this community engagement, but that the Bunch Center will be inclusive throughout the state and making sure that whatever public engagement we do will be the best one south of heaven, north of hell.
Okay, so there's okay.
I agree.
All right, so there's a motion on the floor from Vice Chair Brown to approve the community engagement plan as presented with the notion that the Bunch Center will be as inclusive as possible in its efforts. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second it, but I just want to make a comment if that's appropriate.
Okay, yes, it is appropriate. So it has been moved and seconded to adopt the community engagement plan as presented with the notion that the Bunch Center will be as inclusive as possible. Is there any discussion on this matter?
Yeah, I just want to comment. I hear all the concerns that have been voiced, but I'm going to echo what my colleague Reggie Jones Sawyer stated. I currently serve as the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, and I'm the longest serving member of the Black Caucus in the legislature. And in my almost 12 plus years of being there, the Bunch Center has been engaged in everything that we have done. And bringing on the Bunch Center is not exclusive to anyone else or any organization, but they were critical in helping Dr. Weber move this legislation forward to create this task force. So it's a lot of great organizations out there. And I think Dr. Brown clearly stated, we're going to make sure it's inclusive. And I don't think that should be a fear of any of us that the list that you saw by Dr. Grills or the presentation is excluding anyone. It's just a framework of what we will do. And I too want the churches involved. I want civil rights organizations involved. So I think we're going to get that with UCLA, and I just leave it at that. It shouldn't be any fears that someone's going to be excluded just because we've identified the Bunch Center to move forward with this work.
Thank you, Member Bradford. I also have two questions, but in the interest of time, I'll truncate them, but I'll just say them for the matter of record. I had a question around the budget, what information can be shared around that at this time. And then also in terms of the reach element, as I said before, like, will it be a subjective or quantitative criterion for determining reach, or would it be a confluence of subjective and quantitative data? Are there any other questions from the members?
Call for any other questions?
Okay, so I will now, hearing no further discussion, we will vote. The vote will be by roll call, and I will now call on Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then call on Ms. Belton to conduct the roll call vote. Ms. Parliamentary Johnson, you are recognized.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Belton, would you please call for the roll, call the roll for the vote?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. Chair Moore, your vote, please.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Aye.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown votes aye. Senator Stephen Bradford?
Aye.
Senator Stephen Bradford votes aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills?
Aye.
Dr. Cheryl Grills votes aye. Lisa Holder?
Aye.
Lisa Holder votes aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer?
Aye.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer votes aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis?
Aye.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis votes aye. Don Tamaki?
Aye.
Don Tamaki votes aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp?
Aye.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Chair Moore, on this motion, there are 9 aye votes, 0 nay votes, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. The vote was 9 yeses and 0 nays. The ayes have it and the motion carries. We will now move to agenda item 5, which is our first witness panel of the task force. This witness panel will start promptly now until 12 p.m. The witness panel is related to a primer on national reparations efforts and the international law framework for reparatory justice. At this time, I would like to remind each witness that their testimony is going to be recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. I will now introduce our esteemed speakers. Our first expert is Cam Howard. Cam Howard is a Chicago businessman and real estate investor. Mr. Howard has been a 16-year member of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA, the longest running active organization championing the cause of reparations in the United States. Mr. Howard has led NCOBRA as its national male co-chair since 2017. I'd also like to introduce Roy Brooks. Professor Brooks is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego School of Law. Professor Brooks teaches and writes on civil rights and international human rights, and has been involved with truth and reconciliation and reparative justice efforts around the world. So at this time, Cam Howard will have 15 minutes. Professor Brooks will then have 15 minutes. And then we will take comments and questions from the task force for the remaining 30 minutes. And then we will conclude at noon, where we will then have a lunch break. So at this time, I would like to recognize Cam Howard. Welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to begin by first thanking Governor Newsom for signing this legislation into law and creating the task force. Congratulations on this win. I'd like to thank the California General Assembly for moving this legislation to the governor's desk. And certainly I want to thank Secretary of State Weber for introducing this legislation as an assembly person in the California legislature. Also thank the task force for inviting me here today. I come before this task force today as a Black man in America, a descendant of Africans enslaved in the United States, a descendant of Africans targeted for Jim Crow apartheid violence and racial discrimination, and a person born shortly before the end of legal racial segregation who has witnessed and or endured all manner of continued injustices and harms directed at Blacks in America. I came into the reparations movement because of these injustices, both collective and personal. As a young man, aged 27, I was unjustly accused, convicted, and incarcerated for a crime that never happened. Like many Black men who come in contact with the criminal justice systems in America, evidence plays absolutely no part in the proceedings. As a result, I was sentenced to 20 years of incarceration, which I completed 9 years and 9 months as a result of the quote unquote good time I earned. It was that racial injustice that caused me to become an activist and leader while in prison, among some of the most violent and dangerous men in the state of Illinois. After leaving prison, I spent 9 years crafting a real estate investment business. Early success allowed me to go back to school and earn an MBA with a concentration in real estate. Free of economic hardship, I renewed my activism by throwing myself completely into the reparations struggle, something that I was introduced to while in prison by reading a book entitled Introduction to Black Studies by California's own Dr. Maulana Karenga. I joined NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, in 2006, and fastly moved up the leadership ranks as a result of my intense thought contributions and redress actions. I currently serve as a national male co-chair in my third 2-year term. NCOBRA was formed in 1987. Prior to becoming national male co-chair, I served as our legislative commission chair. In that role, I led the National African American Reparations Commission, NARC, in revising the federal legislation HR 40 that became the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. The revision changed the bill from a pure study bill to a remedy bill. In addition to serving as a NARC commission, I was sought to sit on the advisory committee of the African American Redress Network, a joint collaboration with Howard University's Thurgood Marshall Law Center and Columbia University's Human Rights Center. I chair or serve as the director of several other national reparations formations, including First Repair, whose executive director is none other than Robin Ruth Simmons, former council member in Evanston, who will soon deliver the first local reparations initiative in this country. I've spoken in many major cities in America where there are large Black populations, as well as internationally in South Africa, Ethiopia, and recently Guinea-Bissau. I gave testimony in April of this year before the Congress of the United States during the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee hearing HR 40, exploring the path to reparatory justice in America. I entitled my presentation then, Reparations is Full Repair and the Need to Pass HR 40 Now. I would like to begin my remarks today by reminding or informing this task force of the September 2001 United Nations Human Rights Commission's hosting of a global conference in Durban, South Africa. That conference, the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances, attracted 14,000 attendees. There were 3 major outcomes sought by the North and South American contingent of African descendants who attended that conference. 1, that the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and apartheid were crimes against humanity. 2, that there was an economic basis to those crimes. And 3, that reparations were due. They were successful in the conference outcome document, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The international community of states declared that these actions were in fact crimes against humanity and should always have been so. Thus, there was an economic basis to these crimes. In other words, that the wealth as well as poverty that we see in nations around the world and peoples around the world today is rooted in those crimes. And three, that the countries with African descendant populations have an obligation to engage in redress with and for those populations. The concluding outcome document of that conference and its declarations is the foundation, the very foundation of the current reparations movement in America and globally. This is worth repeating. The transatlantic slave trade and Jim Crow apartheid were and are crimes against humanity, which has no statute of limitations, meaning that if the entity that engaged in those crimes or its antecedent entity, the entity from which it grew from, still exists today, that entity is still, in fact, subject to the obligations of redress for the initial and ongoing crimes that it committed. They were enriched by these crimes, and the victims of these crimes were negatively impacted, meaning that they suffered injury. That impact continues in their descendants today, thus necessitating redress, not only for the crimes committed, but also for the continuing injury. So we have this international model for reparatory justice: crimes, injury, repair. This model was written in the revised version of HR 40. This legislation, HR 40, in Congress now has an unprecedented 193 co-sponsors and was successfully passed out of the House Judiciary Committee on April 14th of this year. We're urging Congress to schedule a floor vote in the House. And HR 40 also has a companion bill in the Senate, S40. The findings and purpose of California's AB31 legislation, the bill that created this task force, charge you with your duties, will lift it word for word from HR 40. Thus, the above model, crimes, injury, repair, also lays the foundation and provides the direction for the work of this task force. Specifically, this task force is charged to uncover and document the crimes committed against African descendants in California. African descendants is an international term indicating persons whose ancestors were violently kidnapped from the African continent during the transatlantic slave trade and forced into enslavement in the Americas. Your legislation particularly addresses African descendants of the U.S. enslavement experience. In doing so, first is the required understanding that there were international crimes committed in this country in California in three distinct periods. The first period was the period of the slave trade and enslavement, 1619, 1865. You are asked to uncover those crimes committed in the state of California, or if you prefer using harms, you can use that language instead of crime. Second period was the period of Jim Crow apartheid. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separate development. It is backed by governmental policy and state-committed sanctioned violence and terror. You are tasked with uncovering those crimes committed in the state of California. And the third period is post-Jim Crow apartheid period, 1965 to the present. Police terror, predatory lending, mass incarceration, some of those crimes. As in the first two periods, you're also tasked with the duty to uncover and document and catalog those harms. After dealing with the harms, we next come to injuries. A host of injuries have resulted in current living Black Californians because of the crimes of harms committed during those three periods. The duty of the task force is to determine and quantify, when possible, the wide range of injury that exists among Black Californians. And COBRA offers assistance here. For more than 20 years, we've indicated to the government of the United States that there are 5 major injury areas that the legacy of those harms negatively play out in the lives of Black Americans today. Those 5 injury areas are: 1, poverty and wealth, the economic reality of Black America that's revealed in less wealth, unemployment and underemployment, lack of access to capital for business development, and et cetera. 2, the criminal justice system, historically and today has been used as a means of economic exploitation, dehumanization, and domination. 3, education, disproportionately skewing the resources to educate our children in ways that intentionally prohibited and prohibits self-sufficiency, American and global competitiveness, and esteem, cultural worth, and value in our people. The 4th injury area, health, from inhumane experimentation to denial of historical trauma and its children, transgenerational transmission of trauma, and transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, the health profile of Black America is one of immense crisis. And 5, peoplehood, the devastating attack on African humanity, identity, and culture, producing not only among whites, but also among some Blacks, a belief system that confers an immense value on whiteness while simultaneously criminalizing and violently devaluing Blackness. This resulted in anti-Black behavior by whites and retarding potential in Black people. These injury areas have to be examined by this task force. Finally, then, there's repair. Uncovering and identifying the harms, quantifying and illuminating the injury naturally leads to reparatory mechanisms to redress those injuries. Here, written into AB3121, is your mandate to propose remedies in alignment with international norms of full reparations, which NCOBRA calls full repair, as well as special measures. Full reparations enshrined in international law has as its object to, quote, wipe away all consequences, unquote, of the crimes or harms. The framework for achieving that challenge consists of 5 components. Component 1, cessation, assurances, and guarantees of non-repetition. A state responsible for wrongfully injuring a people is under an obligation to A, cease the act if it's continuing, and B, offer appropriate assurances and guarantees of non-repetition. The second component is restitution and repatriation. Here, one is charged to reestablish the situation which existed before the wrongful act was committed, to restore the victim to the original situation before gross violations of international law occurred. How includes restoration of freedom, recognition of humanity, identity, culture, repatriation, livelihood, and wealth. 3, compensation. The injuring state is obligated to compensate for the damage if damages is not made good by restitution. Compensation is any financially accessible damage suffered. Proper compensation is such that it's appropriate and proportional to the gravity of the violation and circumstances. The 4th component, satisfaction, as a means of reparations for moral damage, such as emotional injury, mental suffering, and injury to reparation. And finally, 5, rehabilitation. Rehabilitation consists of mind, body, emotional, and spiritual healing. Healing of the lasting effects of the trauma of enslavement and segregation, post-segregation crimes. Briefly, after full reparations, special measures must also be taken into account. Special measures is a wide range of policies that may not normally be introduced. However, because of the severity of the harms and the injury, they become absolutely necessary under international law. In addition, special measures requires the collaboration of all governmental instruments and bodies. Thus, I have attempted to lay out broad but also specific guidelines for the duty of this task force. It is needless to say that your work will inform the federal government, as well as local and other state reparatory justice efforts around the country. NCOBRA is committed to encouraging synchronistic actions in these reparatory efforts. You have added in our mission by basing your legislation on HR 40, on which other municipalities and states have followed. NCOBRA is here for continued assistance to this task force every step of the way going forward. And with that, I would say, Asante Sana, many thanks for the justice work you have engaged and for allowing NCOBRA to offer our aid. A Luda Continua, Pamoja Tashindi, and Mili Shaka. The struggle continues. Together, we will be victorious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Howard, for your expert testimony. We will now go to Professor Roy Brooks. Professor Roy Brooks, you are recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps I should say a bit more about my background before I go through my statement. And I'm just going to highlight aspects of the statement. I assume that people have already read that. I graduated from Yale Law School, where I served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. Upon graduating from law school, I clerked for a federal judge, and then I worked for a time as a corporate lawyer on Wall Street at the firm of Cravath, Swain and Moore, before becoming a law professor at the University of San Diego Law School. and I'm in my 43rd year of teaching, both at the University of San Diego and at another school, actually two other schools. And during that time, I produced, with the help of some very capable students, over 20 books and 100 articles. The last 25 years, I've been focusing on past atrocities and post-conflict justice, writing a few books and several articles on that. And I got into the study of past atrocities, of redress, and I do refer to it as redress rather than reparations, because reparations is just one way of responding to a past atrocity, one way of effectuating post-conflict justice. There are others, and I talk about that in my statement. An editor of an academic press asked me if I would look at the matter of reparations. This was in the mid-1990s. And I rejected that because I thought that the notion was rather foolish, and that there was really nothing to be gained from spending time and effort on that. But then he proposed that I look at it from an international perspective, which I did, and spent a great deal of time and a number of years traveling the globe, basically, and presenting papers and studying with study groups around the world, in Poland, in Copenhagen, and I saw there, looking at the various ways in which governments responded to their past atrocities, that there were some best practices. And one of the practices is the one that I prefer, which is the Atonement Model. But before I get into that, what I'd like to do is to just sort of go through and to highlight various components of the international redress movement. I think that there are conceptual tools there, as well as experiences, which can greatly help us think through this complicated question of redress and slavery. There are two basic methods, and understand we're talking about civil redress, not criminal redress. There are two basic ways of pursuing civil redress. One is what I term the tort model, the other is the atonement model. The tort model is backward looking, it is victim focused, and it is compensatory. That is to say, its main purpose is to seek compensatory justice and sometimes punitive justice. And that is sort of the received tradition. It certainly was a received tradition when I came on the scene in the mid-1990s. The competing model, which I saw in international experiences, is the atonement model. And that model, in contrast to the tort model, is forward-looking. It is perpetrator focused, and it is restorative. In other words, its primary mission is to seek restorative justice. And restorative justice means restoring a broken relationship between the victims and the perpetrator of an atrocity, and also to give the perpetrator of an atrocity the opportunity to restore its moral character in the aftermath of the atrocity. And the atonement model has two components. One is atonement and the other is forgiveness. Atonement is the perpetrator side of the equation, and that requires the perpetrator to issue a genuine apology. And there are various ways of defining that term, which I can do, and which I do in the statement. I'd be happy to elaborate on that. And also to make the apology believable by doing a redemptive act. And that redemptive act is a reparation. So the concept of reparation under the atonement model is quite different from the concept of reparation under the tort model. under the atonement model, the purpose of the reparation is to make the apology believable, to concretize the apology. And so the sincerity of the apology is calculated by the weight of the reparations. And I think that's quite important. And once a sufficient atonement, that is to say, apology plus reparations, has been tendered by the perpetrator, then the question of forgiveness arrives on the victim's desk, kind of like a subpoena, a civic one, not a moral one, because there's no moral obligation attached to the victims here. It attaches to the perpetrator. And the question of how does one manifest forgiveness, or whether one should, that is a question that the victims have to determine. I do not get into that in my statement because I was asked to focus basically on the perpetrator. So you have the atonement model and versus the tort model. Then there are reparations. There are various types of reparations. There are compensatory reparations, which are reparations that go to the victim or the victim's family. These can be cash or non-cash reparations. And then there are rehabilitative reparations, and these are cash or non-cash reparations that go to the victim's community. They're designed to rebuild the community in the aftermath of the atrocity. They are asset building reparations. They're quite different from the compensatory reparations. Now, I prefer, as I said, the atonement model, not because it's something that I sort of came up with, but I think it is superior to the tort model. And that can be seen with the following example. Let us suppose that you are standing on the street and some stranger or someone even that you know walks by and steps on your foot and looks back at you and keeps going, doesn't apologize. How insulting is that? And it seems to me that redress ought to be about the dignity that has been visited upon the victims. It ought to be about a reconciliation, making this society better, making our state better. It ought to be about elevating our humanity as a people. So that is why I prefer the atonement model to the tort model. In terms of reparations, I am not in favor of compensatory reparations because they are so complicated. So, for example, most reparations, compensatory reparations, are direct cash payments. Well, the individual can take that and gamble, go to Las Vegas to gamble it away, and that gives evidence to Chris Rock's famous quip that the only one who is going to benefit from reparations is Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I can tell you the experience in South Africa, talking with the attorneys there and working with the attorneys there on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I did, and also talking with attorneys who have represented victims there and speaking with them at international conferences. And they tell me that after 1 year, the victims are poor again. The solution to that, some would say, well, let's have conditional cash payments, meaning that you can only use the money for certain purposes. That is morally reprehensible in the view of many individuals, including myself, because you're denying agency to the victims. And we don't do that with anyone else who receives a compensation from an injury. So the other problem with compensatory reparations is that they are very, very difficult to formulate, difficult to administer, and difficult to determine who gets them and who does not. So for all of those reasons, I do propose and recommend strongly rehabilitative reparations, but I do not suggest that you provide a hodgepodge of rehabilitative reparations. In other words, you should focus on one or two important items. And in the paper, my statement, I recommend boarding schools as a focus. And why? Well, because boarding schools are foundational. Once you get a good education, it opens up all kinds of opportunities. There are socioeconomic benefits that derive from that. I look at the African American students who were my classmates at Yale Law School, including one Clarence Thomas, and all of them have done well economically, socioeconomically, and more importantly, their children and grandchildren have done well. They've gone to very good schools and they've gotten very good jobs, and I think that that's foundational. The other reason why I would focus on boarding schools and education in general is because what we've learned from Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund is that focusing on education is a very good way to attack racial injustice. It's sort of a leader in the vanguard of the attack, because it's very hard to argue against education, quality education. So for these reasons, I do recommend boarding schools that would be located throughout the state of California in green belts, that is to say, not in the city, but outside of the cities. And one thing to understand about education is that education takes place less in the classroom than at home doing homework. That's where it takes place. And my daughter, who attended Princeton, the Princeton had the system where they would have tutors available at 12 midnight at 2 in the morning for students. And that's the sort of thing that I think a boarding school could do. It would be a total environment which would be conducive to a quality education. And with that, I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brooks, for your expert testimony. At this time, we are going to take comments and questions from the task force. I'll begin. I have a question for Mr. Howard and a comment/question for Professor Brooks. So my question to Mr. Howard, it relates to Evanston and the local reparations model. Evanston made news recently for being, the first in the nation local reparations model, whereby Black Americans, and you can expand on this, Mr. Howard, because I'm sure you know more than me, receive reparations in the form of housing vouchers, which is extremely significant. But there was also some criticism that, the Evanston model wasn't as comprehensive as it could be. So my more pointed question is, how do you have any suggestions or recommendations for how California, the state of California, can improve upon the Evanston model? And my question or comment to Professor Brooks, thank you. In reading your materials, I found it to be quite interesting and informative. I did not see any reference to Kentucky Fried Chicken in your comments. I have a concern because when we talk about compensation, I just wanted to make it clear, my opinion, that and we haven't gotten to the point where we're actually proposing recommendations for what reparations could look like. But I would just like to say, in the event that compensation is, provided, I just want to put on record, I think it's problematic to say that Black Americans who descend from chattel slavery here in the United States would just earn and spend it on frivolous things. There's even data to support that Black Americans, out of all Americans in this country, we save the most, despite having the least. And so I kind of want to get away from this notion that, Black Americans are, just financially illiterate, and, once, reparations are there, they won't have the wherewithal to build their communities or to build their families. So I don't know if you could maybe, I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I just wanted to make a comment in relation
Yes.
to that?
Sure, I'll respond to that, and I can also show you in the paper. It's on page 23. It's this notion about Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's not mine. It's Chris Rock's. Okay, it's not mine, so I just put it in there. But John Cook's experience in South Africa, I think, is very real. And the problem is, it's not so much, that Black people, and then again, I want to get away from that notion that Black people can't be responsible. That's not that's not really the main point there. The main point is that these reparations are going to be so small, they're going to be modest, they're not going to do much. They don't do much anywhere where they've been given, So for example, Japanese American survivors got $20,000 each in terms of reparations and all. It's a one-time payment, that's it. If you want to do a continuous payment, I sort of have models for that, but then that becomes problematic because how do you administer that? And the point here, the larger point, don't miss the larger point here, because the larger point is this, is that there are various ways of doing this. If you complicate this, then you give the proponents, the opponents of reparations ammunition to say, well, look, I want to do this, but it's just too complicated. And they raise questions. What about this? What about that? And you don't go anywhere. You get bogged down in their issues. But if you make it straightforward, and if you use the precedents that we have with education and the legal defense fund, I think you're going to get opposition, but you have less complications, and you have I think your moral grounds are much clearer.
So, would you like for me to just?
Yes, Mr. Howard, and then I'll recognize Vice Chair Brown. So, Mr. Howard, if you could address my question, thank you.
Sure. So the Evanston model, just speaking to that compensation model that was just stated, question, the Evanston model immediately infuses $25,000 into the asset column of any one of the recipients of the housing initiative. $25,000 in wealth that they didn't have prior to this. So it's an instant contribution of wealth to the family, and wealth that will be held in a home that could be utilized 10, 15, 20 years down the line, and will continue to build wealth on into the future. So there's many ways you can do compensation, and certainly Evanston is a great example of that. I was in Evanston as a member of the National African American Reparations Commission in November of last year. And we were there to, quote unquote, certify the Evanston model as a national model to emulate. And 3 minimum criteria in that certification came out. One is that the injured parties must be the ones who determine what reparations are. You can't go into a community and say this is local reparations, and the injured, meaning African descendants, Black descendants of enslavement, are not the ones who determine what the reparative initiatives are in any location. Second, it is the injured party that has to control and direct the resources once those resources are allotted. And thirdly, that the policy cannot be ordinary public policy. I see what you're doing with the anchor groups, with the, I think, Bunch Center, as part of that process of building that, what we call stakeholder authority amongst the local parties in that particular location. Evanston has a local stakeholders authority, which informs their committee and task force, or their committee, reparations committee, to what the people say is necessary, the priorities of repair that the people are asking for. I think what you're doing by institutionalizing it with the Bunch Center is totally on point and will provide guidance for the nation going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. I would like to recognize Vice Chair Brown. You're recognized.
Madam Chair, members of the task force. Dr. Roy Brooks, I want to shout and run around my house for that definitive statement that you gave about atonement, reckoning, and showing some fruits of repentance. As for me and And my position, education ought to be up at the top. Ignorance is not blissful. Ignorance is dangerous. And if we look at the history of what our oppressors did to us, they made sure that we would not be enlightened. Even we had ancestors who dug what they call pit schools out in the woods, out in the brush harbors. And they learned how to read and write by candlelight and kerosene light. So we have these other areas, yes. But that's the reason why earlier I raised a question when we were discussing the basic groups that we would have involved, that our Alliance of Black School Educators ought to be definitely involved in not just conversation, but in the conduct. I get nervous when I hear all this talk about conversation. I know we got to talk, but as my teacher and friend, Dr. Martin Luther King once said, my God, there are times when we make things a paralysis of an analysis. And what we need is practical, sensible steps that can be held accountable. And in that area of education, my brother, you have a winner there, and you have a friend as a member of this task force. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation.
Member Holder, you are recognized. Yep.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both experts, Mr. Howard and Dr. Brooks, for your presentation and for providing us with these, a variety of conceptual frameworks for thinking about the strategies that we would like to present and thinking about issues of implementation. I don't want to take up a lot of time. I want to get to my questions because I feel like we should be hearing from the speakers right now and utilizing your expertise in this moment. I do have a quick comment and then a question that I'd like to direct toward Mr. Howard. I just want to start off and quote President Kennedy when he was talking about the mission to the moon, his comments at Rice University when he said, anticipating the opposition about implementation and how difficult it's going to be to go to the moon. And what's the point of paying billions of dollars to go to the moon? He said, we do this, that, and the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And this is a hard undertaking to undo 400 years of damage, 400 years of crimes against humanity. It is hard, and we are doing these things because they are hard. So I don't want issues of implementation to govern our conversations about reparations and the moral repair that it represents. I want to direct a question to Mr. Howard. I was very interested in what you had to say about peoplehood. I'd ask for you to expand on that a little bit. And I would also, when you talk to us about peoplehood, I'd like for your comments to also be informed by this notion of individual cash payments and how that form of reparations, not as an exclusive form, but as one form of reparations, how that gels with the notion of peoplehood and also the notion of satisfaction that you mentioned.
For that question, and thank you for that quote as well. And you're absolutely correct. This is an extremely difficult undertaking for anyone to undertake, to bring repair to people whose injury is generational and will last more generations, even with reparative initiatives like these that should come out of this task force. These are generational harms, going to take generations to repair them. So again, I agree totally that this is a very difficult undertaking. And COBRA looks at peoplehood, similarly to, I think someone referenced the 20 or so clergymen that General Sherman met with that resulted in the 40 acres and a mule. They were asked whether or not, what did they think they needed to be free? And they said land, of course. And then they were asked, did they want that land to be amongst white America, or did they want that land amongst themselves? And 95%, or 19 out of 20, said they wanted to be amongst themselves. They wanted to build their own communities, their own culture, their own nation, if you will. So peoplehood looks into the whole idea of sovereignty, looks into self-determination, looks into collective control over your resources, over your institutions, and that nature. And so that was what we lost as a people in this country. That was what was taken away from us. Our language, culture, our ability to self-govern, those things have to be part of our repair. Satisfaction looks at return of our dignity to us. To be governed and to think that the only way we can succeed in any group construct is by being 100% tied to someone who's harmed us for 400 years is a pathological concept. Yes. We have the ability, and we came to this country with the ability to self-govern, and we did so at the highest level in history. Some of our governments that we had prior to coming to America were in a much higher moral standing than America is today. And so part of that peoplehood is to get back to that understanding that we can collectively govern and solve our own issues if given the right resources, the right time, and the right will, we can do those type of things. When it comes to individual payments as part of peoplehood, historically, Black people in this country have utilized our resources in a collective manner. That's historically. We wouldn't have the Black churches. We wouldn't have historical Black institutions. We wouldn't have the 5,000 banks that we had from 1904 to probably 1930 if it wasn't for Black people collectively utilizing our resources. I'm of the belief that if we're given compensation in the form of individual direct payments, 25 to 35% of us, and I don't know where I'm getting that number from, but I'm saying a significant number of us would collectively pool our resources to build community that we once had in this country that was only removed with the event of dumping drugs into our community, primarily with crack cocaine in this country, that began to deteriorate our sense of community, which again is one of those post-Jim Crow crimes that would have been committed against us. And we need to look at how devastating our communities are as a result of crack cocaine, that particular injury. But certainly if cash direct payments were given to us as a people, I'm under the belief that we will utilize them in a collective manner because that is also part of our culture.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Are there some questions from the task force members at this time? I can see everyone. I had a question for Roy Brooks, Professor Brooks. Oh, sorry, Reggie Jones, sorry, I see your hand. You're recognized.
Professor Brooks, from a legal standpoint, if you look at, and I think you kind of addressed some of it, really kind of our legal standing. As we all know, colonizers came in and take away land and then used the natural resources to benefit themselves. They did in Africa, they did in Native Americans here. In addition, when wealth is really defined by land, that wealth gap is that the fact that there were laws on the books that DIs who fought for this country weren't able to buy in white neighborhoods, or that we had redlining, or that banks wouldn't lend to us, and that insurance companies wouldn't give us insurance for housing. Can we make a case, and a legal case, that we should have some kind of program or something that specifically talks about getting land back to African Americans so we can help close the wealth gap. You kind of said it in a way that we need to do things that will build generational wealth or build generational education that will build the Black community so that we can at least be equal with our white counterparts, and so that we can move ahead and compete on a level basis. Does that make any legal sense?
Yeah, the problem is that, and this is the case with most atrocities, past atrocities, and again, we're talking about past atrocities, that they were legal when they took place. So slavery was legal under United States law, the Constitution, and statutory law, and indeed in the Dred Scott case, Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court said that the Black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. And that's broad. There were some state court justices, like in North Carolina, which sort of drew a distinction between the written law and the unwritten law. That is to say, the constitutional law, statutory law, and the common law. And under the common law, the slaves had some rights. They had the right not to be killed, for example. You can work them to death, but you couldn't outright kill them. This was under some interpretations of the common law. And the problem that any effort to redress a past atrocity here in the United States has is the Supreme Court. Because your redress is going to be, redress by definition is asymmetrical. In other words, it only includes, it only involves, it only targets the victims of the atrocities. Japanese Americans received redress for their internment during the Second World War. African Americans are not entitled to that redress because we weren't victimized by that particular atrocity. So that's how it works. And I might also say as a footnote that these asymmetrical measures do not repeal or obviate the need for ongoing civil rights laws. We're still going to need them, okay? And these measures are sort of they're not asymmetrical, they are symmetrical. They are applicable to more than just say African Americans. Whites have Title VII rights, for example. So so that's the problem. But I think that there's a way around this. I don't know, it has to be tested, that I give in the paper, and that is that I suggest that the redress should be directed not on the basis of race, but on the basis of connection to slavery, that is, say, an enslaved descendant. And there is ample research out there that shows about 300,000 slaves in America in the 17th and 18th century were white. We call some of them indentured servants, but they died in their servitude at all, and they certainly saw themselves as slaves. So there's some very powerful scholarship on that. And so if you base your redress on slave descendants, that is to say, the individuals would have to show some connection to slavery, that gets away from the Supreme Court's rather restrictive interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which would prevent any kind of race conscious. Now, that's where the Supreme Court is going. Right now, it does allow for race conscious measures in response to the institution's own past discrimination. Okay. But that's going, with the current Supreme Court, that's going by the wayside. I would make the argument that your report, that any statement on redress for slavery ought to have a protest statement in there. In other words, to say that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, which makes redress difficult, because people say, well, why don't you just say, we're talking about blacks, why don't we do, well, we are, but we can't. The Supreme Court won't allow that. And the Supreme Court's interpretation is the sequel to and the present day embodiment of these corrupt laws that allow slavery to exist in the first place. So I would not go into the night silent. I would protest. I would put that in as my statement and say that this is simply a present day embodiment of these corrupt laws that made the atrocities possible in the first place. But that's a big problem that you're going to have dealing with that, and in particular with respect to land. Native Americans have tried that. The Supreme Court that won't allow that. South Africa, that's the big issue there about land, because that's what the Black South Africans want. That there's resistance there too. And I would just say, just sort of to conclude on this particular point, there's an old saying that you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. You can't, so if you have a measure, if you can get something, get it. And it doesn't mean, I'm the last person that would say that at this stage you ought to take into account the political calculations, because that's not how civil rights thinking and scholarship goes. If that were the case, then we would not have had abolitionists talk about ending slavery when they knew it was politically impossible. We would not have had civil rights lawyers in the 1920s and 30s and 40s talking about equal rights when they knew that that was not possible. The job of the civil rights scholar, the civil rights thinker, is to determine the moral direction in which the society should go, to set the moral compass of society, and fight like hell to bring that about. And you make that statement before you get into the horse trading, which is the political process. At least you know where you want to go and where the country should go. And you may not get all of that because of the political process, but you have that statement out there. It was important that we had abolitionists advocating for the end of slavery. That statement is out there. That statement is out there.
Thank you.
Member Scott Lewis, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairperson Moore. Mr. Roy Brooks, I would be interested in hearing from you your thoughts about how, say, an atonement model would, respond not just to the issue of injury, but also to the related matter of the benefits of the injuries of slavery, Jim Crow, etc. So I think there's more than just an issue of the injury, but that injury was financially beneficial to we can consider a whole host of entities who benefited. But it's important to remember that slavery, right, was an economic system, not just purely a political. And so even to this very day, we have institutions who financially benefited from the foundational injuries that was the economic system of slavery. And how we can I see some of representation showing up in Mr. Howard, but I am interested how atonement might actually respond to the actual benefit of injury. Benefit here meaning the financial benefit.
Yeah, I think that redress ought to take into account the lingering effects of the atrocity. Okay, that's the main way of responding to the atrocity. And that hence my recommendation of boarding schools. And the atonement model, what it does, it places the burden of redress on the perpetrator, not the victim. Under the tort model, it's on the victim. The victim has to do all the damn work. But under the atonement model, it's the perpetrator that does the work. If you're gonna, if you're saying you're sorry, if this is a genuine apology, well, show it, okay, and propose it. You can make, well, now we don't like that. We're having negotiation. Let's do something more. That's the way the process ought to work, as opposed to having the victims who don't have the resources. I mean, this is unusual that a state government agency is putting resources into studying this. Usually the victims don't have the resources to come up with an appropriate reparations. They know what the pain is. So what the atonement model does, it places the burden on the perpetrator, and it says, look, what we're trying to do here is to make this a better society. We're trying to elevate the humanity of our society. What's wrong with talking about reparations in those terms, in the high-minded terms, as opposed to say, just give me the money. And I can tell you this, that a check of $25,000 one time, that's not gonna return the victims to the status quo ante. When you're talking about atrocities, nothing really can return the victims to the status quo ante. Just this week in San Diego alone, there were 2 meetings of Japanese Americans still talking about the internment. And this is 30 years after they received reparations. It wasn't enough. What they got wasn't enough. It's nothing is going to return the victim to the status quo ante. And that is the underlying, I think, folly of the tort model. The thing that a cash payment to the victims is going to be sufficient. And I can tell you, having been around the world and around this country talking with individuals about this, the conservatives are going to say, yeah, I'll buy that. And it's all over. You can't talk about race anymore. Okay, here's your money. That's it. Deal's closed. It's a settlement. It's a settlement. And the way settlements work in the law is that the defendant doesn't admit to liability.
Yeah.
Okay, you end the matter, and it works to the benefit of the defendant. It works to the benefit of the perpetrator. You're letting the perpetrator off the hook by going in that direction.
Okay. Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Just very briefly, without commenting basically on what the task force should do. Just speaking of the Japanese American reparations effort, it was an atonement model, and I can tell you how controversial it was. And it was controversial because it didn't even approximate the actual harm of people who lost their lives and who lost their property. And it boiled down to the point of how to make the apology concrete and meaningful. And there were some who said, they can never compensate me. I won't take a penny. The harm is irreparable. There were others who basically said, in order for the apology to be meaningful, it's got to be a significant number. And basically the $20,000 determination was a wild ass guess. I mean, it was a number. It wasn't based on anything. And but to this day, I have to say, for many of the people who are still alive, they kind of, they cared more about the apology and the recognition and the acknowledgement of the harm than they did the actual money, because the money didn't really approximate what they lost. But I'm not saying that experience is at all equivalent to what Black people have suffered in America. I'm just only saying that was a huge controversy in the Japanese American community, to the point that people didn't talk to each other. They were so angry about the outcome. But in passage of 40 years, there is a consensus that acknowledgement was a good thing for the country. So I'll leave it at that. But if we look at the Japanese American model, it was an atonement model, wasn't a compensatory model.
That's interesting. Thank you for that, Member Tamaki. Member Holder, you're recognized.
A question for Dr. Brooks regarding the atonement model. I'm a civil rights attorney and a litigator. I don't want to get too wonky in my questioning right now, but I do have a question about your comments about the Supreme Court and how this is going to pass muster and judicial scrutiny. Specifically, I want to know if you've given thought to this notion of atonement, the moral betterment of society. If that's the basis for reparations. Is that the type of basis that could meet strict scrutiny? Because as we know, governments can do certain things, under the equal protection framework, if it can meet strict scrutiny, which is a standard that is extremely onerous. We all know that. But I'm wondering if there are any cases that have looked at moral atonement as the basis for a government policy and come out on the other side saying that meets strict scrutiny because it makes us better as a society.
Boy, if only the Supreme Court would think like that, our society would be much better off. I am not aware of any cases where that has happened. As a matter of fact, and focus on what's coming down, the road here, as opposed to what is behind us. The Supreme Court is moving in the opposite direction, because as I indicated earlier, it was that you could pass a strict scrutiny if the race conscious program was designed to compensate for your own past discrimination. Okay. And this is how many of the affirmative action programs were set up, and so that the victims, the beneficiaries of the program, were not necessarily the victims of the institution's own past discrimination. That was really nice. But now, what the court is saying, what the members of the court are going for, is that strict scrutiny means that yes, you can compensate for your own past discrimination, that will meet the constitutional ends test. But the means test is that you have to deal with non-race conscious remedies. Okay, so you would have to deal with race neutral remedies. You could not, in affirmative action, which is basically what you're doing here. It's really, so when I say asymmetrical, it's affirmative action structurally. That's not going to happen. They're saying, and the way in which they're going is that yes, we want to do something about discrimination. We don't like discrimination and past discrimination, yes, but your remedy has to be race neutral. Okay, two wrongs don't make a right. That's the thinking there. And it's not only the Constitution, but you also have Prop 209 to deal with. And it's the same kind of hurdle. And I think the way to get around this, and I have the benefit of having law students who are thinking about this in the context of my class, and they're looking at this, the very issue that you're looking at, but they have other tools to use, and just generally thinking about how can you be progressive with this Supreme Court? And the way to do it is to try to find race neutral means which will get you to where you want to go. So for example, in New Haven, Connecticut, this was after the Ritchie case, where the Supreme Court said that you could not use race conscious measures to compensate for your own past discrimination. This has to do with a slightly different matter, but that was the basic notion, the basic norm that the Supreme Court was working with. So what the city of New Haven did subsequently is that because what they wanted to do was to bring more minorities into the command structure of their police and fire departments. So what they did in a city which is 60% minority, they gave a preference to people who live there. So the preference was race neutral. It was based upon residency, not upon race. And now most of the command structure in New Haven is minority. Okay, so you achieve this progressive end working within the system that the Supreme Court has created for you. But I really think that it is important to have a statement of protest in there to say, hey, what you are doing, Supreme Court, is you are basically what you're doing is really sequel to the laws which enable this atrocity to take place in the first place.
Okay.
If
Thank you.
I
I
can
have
jump
one.
in.
Go ahead, Mr. Howard. Go ahead.
Sure. And one of the reasons we use international norms and international law because it's expanded beyond civil rights law in this country. And if we get boggled down in the civil rights law framework, then we're going to always be on the losing end. And so we use terms like crimes against humanity. Look, you use terms like African descendants. African descendant is a specific international designation of people who were robbed from the African continent during a multi-country criminal enterprise that they call trade, shipped all over the West and submitted to all forms of economic exploitation and abuse and crime, and more crimes. And their descendants today still are injured as a result of those crimes. That's the framework. I stated earlier that I'm an advisor of the African American Redress Network with Thurgood Marshall Law School at Howard University and the Human Rights Center of Columbia University. We are positioning ourselves to deal with this issue in Evanston because there are people who have said that this is race-based. We're saying that this is a crime-based, harm-based remedy to particular people who crimes were addressed to. The fact that they were of African descent, that's secondary, and it wipes away this notion that white people were enslaved and they should also be, included into this body of redress, because the people who this legislation is for are people who have a history of criminal activities directed toward them by this particular government. And so the argument moves away from this is a race-based issue to a crime-based issue. And we think that we can make sure, we think that we can win on that particular level, because America is a signature of several international documents from which this language is encoded. And so they have to listen to this language and they have to utilize in some of their deliberations, whether they do or they don't, it's another thing, but we can base that argument. And so I wouldn't look at trying to narrowly focus on, strict scrutiny or that this has to pass, some other non-race-based test. The key here is there are African descendants in America, and that designation brings with it a whole lot. It's the same thing as if you have a refugee and a political asylum seeker as opposed to an immigrant. There are two different designations or three different designations that has a body of law wrapped around each one of those. There's different laws that are directed toward political asylum seekers or political prisoners than they are regular prisoners or regular immigrants into a country. And so we have to step outside of this framework that we've been imprisoned by over the last several hundred years in civil rights law.
Can I say something? I have to leave at 12 because I have a class, but I do wanted to say something in response to Mr. Howard. The critical point is this, is that slavery was legal in the United States and even under international law at the time that it happened. It did not become illegal under international law until a convention in 1898, and then really a convention, I think it was in 1920, 1923. And also, there are any number of doctrines in international law which cut off liability for succeeding regimes. That says you're not responsible for what happened there. There are several doctrines in international law, and chapter 4 of the book, Atonement and Forgiveness, talks about those. And the last point I want to make is that you cannot ignore domestic law. I mean, international law really means nothing in domestic courts unless the Supreme Court recognizes it. And so right now, the strict scrutiny test, that is where we are. And that's what you have to play with. And as a lawyer, I would say that I would not go into any court arguing other than the strict scrutiny. And there are ways around there, okay? And even, Mr. Howard's indication that they were moving, that it's not race conscious, that's kind of an indication that that one should try to frame this under protest, try to frame this in sort of race neutral ways. I am so sorry, but I do, if I'm not, and actually the class I'm going into is looking at a lot of these things that you're looking at. It's my class on international redress, and I need to get there in time. If I don't, my students will knock down my door here and drag me into the classroom. So I'm sorry, I have to leave now, but I do.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Mr. Brooks, Dr.
Yes.
Brooks.
Yes, sir.
Before you go, I can appreciate the global picture that Dr. Howard was presenting, yes. Dealing with the human family, yes. But the scene of the crime that we're dealing with is the state of California. And we have specificities of what was done in California. Under Peter Burnett, the first governor, we have specificities in California of that case of R.C. Lee, 1857, 1858. That's exact, that's definite. We have specifics of what redevelopment, so-called redevelopment agencies did in the last 50 years plus to dislocate Black folks. We got to quantify and localize a lot of this stuff about reparations and getting reckoning and redemption to specifics. If you're going to get people turned on to what you want. That's where I'm coming from, personally. Let's be specific. Let's be rational. Let's be definite. And then you can nail them. You're not going to convince these folks. Their hearts ain't going to change that much for us. They still got in them what was said by Aristotle during the 4th century BC, that we were inferior, that we would never be capable of self-governance. Please, I beg us all, stay on point and nail them and not be of a shotgun with blasts and pellets all over the place, but not hitting the target. But if we could take the rifle approach, then we are ahead and we're on top of the game.
I would say this, that if I have to go, but if the committee would like to talk with me further, just, you know how to reach me. And in particular, if you would like, my students to research anything in particular, you have a competent staff there, obviously, but if you would want that, just let me know and we can accommodate that. But I do have to leave before they knock down my door. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Yes, so I did have a question for Roy Brooks, but I understand that you have to leave, but just putting on record.
Go ahead, please.
I had a comment about footnote 77, where it seemed as if you were, in talking about the potential constitutionality of a reparations program, conflating indentured servitude with chattel slavery. And I wanted to make a comment and say, I think those two institutions should not be conflated. And I still think that we can adhere to your preliminary thoughts in your testimony by, instead of, this program being race-based, lineage or based on the institution of slavery, that will still hold true to our mandate. But in utilizing, the institution of slavery as the means, we will see that many, if not none, anyway, people were chattel slaves in the true sense that Black Americans were.
Yeah, and that footnote is important because it really does talk to the constitutional and the Prop 209 issue. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to show that this is not race conscious. And what the book White Cargo does, it shows that
You cut out. Did Professor Brooks cut out, or me?
It's probably fine. It sounds like he really needed to go anyway, so.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you. Mr. Howard, I would like to yield to you if you had any closing comments before we go to break.
Yeah, I would just like to state that the legal question is one that you allow lawyers to fight out. It should not be something that should limit what amount of redress you offer or what amount of redress you present to the California Assembly to fund. There's a framework that we offered, international framework, is one that is enshrined in the legislation. The compensation that seems to have been so much focus on today is only one aspect of reparations. Certainly we are in total agreement that it should be a part of any type of reparations proposal package that comes out of the task force as well as the federal government. But there are generational crimes that will continue for generational injuries, that will continue for generations if those are not fully addressed, and compensation cannot address those. So that's why a full reparative package and framework is necessary for us to look at all the ways in which reparative initiatives should be brought toward our people so that these harms are not perpetuated in the future. Final thing is the aspect of that brother Dr. Scott Lewis brought up. In this document, we talk about the 4 classes of criminals. Governments is just one. State and local and federal governments are just one class. Also are the corporations in California that also played a part in some of the crimes and injuries that we suffer from today. You are tasked to also examine those. You're also tasked to examine the institutions, whether they're religious institutions or educational institutions. Also, you're tasked to examine crimes committed by foundations and families, where that economic benefit has continued on into this day. With that economic benefit that Dr. Scott Lewis talked about in the corporate and institutional as well as family trust funds that exist. So I would also encourage you to look at that well, in addition to what the state of California has done in policy directed at Black Californians.
Thank you so much, Mr. Howard, for your expert testimony.
Chairwoman Moore, can you hear me?
Yes,
Chairwoman Moore?
Yes,
I've been waiting for, thank you. I've been wanting to ask a question of Professor Brooks, but I'd at least like to get it on the record, that I'm having trouble reconciling his recommendation for boarding school for Black children with data in psychology, economics, and the health field that really gives pause about putting too much emphasis on education as a sort of magic bullet that will level the playing field, specifically in economics, employment, and wealth inequity. There are studies that are showing that it's not fixed by education. In psychology, we're seeing racial stress effects of mental health may be, in fact, higher with higher rate levels of education. And then within the health field, mortality rates may be higher among folks who have, Black folks who have higher levels of education. In fact, there's the classic Harvard study that showed higher mortality rates among their graduates with degrees. So, and then there's the cultural problem of placing our children in boarding schools outside of the context of family socialization and community socialization. And then what percentage of children would actually be able to even get into a boarding school. So I just wanted to at least get those questions on the record.
Thank you so much, Member Grills. I apologize for not recognizing you sooner while Professor Brooks was still here. Since we're well received, especially by me. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
At this time, we will move on to our lunch break, and we will resume at 1 o'clock. So I'm asking the public to be ready to resume at 12:50 so that we can start promptly at 1. Thank you.
Just a message to our attendees. We're going to have to stop the broadcast so that we can restart and reconnect to the YouTube. So it's going to say that the session has ended, but just hold tight because we'll restart it as soon as we connect.
To click the link again, or can they just stay on? Like, will it disconnect them? Is that what you're saying?
No, it won't disconnect them. They'll just be put back into like a waiting area where they won't be able to see the meeting, and then we'll just reconnect and they should be fine. I just didn't want them to think that the meeting was over and them and they disconnect while we're on break.
Thank you, Ms. Hurtado. We'll now go to lunch and resume at 12:50. Hard start at 1 o'clock.